So today our presentation is on rules of clinical engagement. And the reason we chose that topic is because a lot of startups fail at that level, and the ripples of that effect are obviously haunting them for a long time. So it is critical. It's a critical step. It needs to be done. And unfortunately, as you will learn today and hear today, there is no shortcut. It's not that there's any magic bullet, but we'll try to do our best explaining the ecosystem, trying to give you our tips, our sort of, from our own experience, how to engage with clinicians so that you can have a successful customer discovery stage, then transitioning into pilots or doing your first sales. Again, that part is critical. And I love that today we have an opportunity to hear from Shelli Pavone, and she has a lot of expertise in this area. So I would like her to introduce herself, tell you a little bit about her background, where she's coming from. During this presentation, you'll better understand the context.
Hi everyone, I'm Shelli Pavone. Thank you, Laura. I have been in the healthcare field for about 20 years now, and I've always focused on the commercial side of the business. And so I've spent much of my career engaging with clinicians and healthcare providers. And for the last 7 or so years, I've really focused in the healthcare startup space and had the opportunity to work with really amazing innovators. And about 2 years ago, I became an entrepreneur myself, focusing in the healthcare space. And really the entire concept of the company I founded is focused on engaging with clinicians from the company perspective. And really, I would say, closing the knowledge gap between industry innovators and entrepreneurs and those that are focused on providing healthcare, and how really both sides can work together to hopefully advance healthcare innovation for everyone. So if we're good, I guess we can go ahead and get started.
Yes, we're good.
Okay, great. So I'm starting off with, an interesting statistic, and it's a little bit of a sad statistic, but it is what it is. 96% of healthcare innovations fail. And, we know there's a pretty high failure rate for innovation in general, but that is much higher in healthcare. And there are certainly many reasons for that, for the high failure rate. And I think that really many of them have to do with that knowledge gap between industry innovators and those that are on the front lines of delivering care. Healthcare is an incredibly complex and also ever evolving industry. And so in order to really kind of gain and maintain that competitive edge, it's really important for companies to innovate continuously. And to do so, they really have to engage expertise in the healthcare space. It's not enough that somebody is a clinician and they're starting a company, because we can't look at things from a singular viewpoint in the healthcare space. You have to make sure that you're sourcing a variety of expertise to make sure that you're ultimately designing problems that both address the needs of the end user and are also without bias. And so we'll talk a little bit about diverse opinions today as well, and how important that is to source. But it can be difficult. It'd be difficult to engage with healthcare providers. Clinicians are busy, and you have to kind of speak their language. And so ultimately, we'll talk a lot today about sort of the best practices for doing that. And like Laura mentioned, there's really no silver bullet, but I think that there are ways that you can go about it to give yourself a better chance of success. And again, as I mentioned, it's really the knowledge gap between industry and with clinicians as well. And so clinicians are frustrated with that failure rate for innovation, because ultimately, a lot of them feel like innovators are setting out to solve problems that they don't really understand, and that they're not always engaging a clinical audience. There are two sides to every problem, and the high failure rate of innovation in healthcare is not just on one side of the equation. And I think that clinicians are frustrated, right? When I get out and I talk with clinicians, I hear, overwhelming frustration, and if you look at the statistics on this slide, I mean, really a very high percentage of them say that the, innovators need to engage the clinical community earlier. They need to engage the clinical community more often. They don't feel that recent healthcare innovations have positively impacted their ability to practice. And they think that companies lack the expertise that they need to disrupt responsibly. And disruption is a really common term for innovators, but in healthcare, we have to be careful with that, because I think that responsible disruption is very important in the healthcare space. Patients' lives are at stake. And so we have to go about it in a very specific way. And we have to make sure that we're engaging stakeholders and end users in the conversation. And, many times that's clinician, but, sometimes that's patients as well. And so really thinking of the viewpoints that you're getting, and are you sourcing diverse viewpoints as well in the process? So again, responsible disruption is needed. Companies face a lot of pressure to innovate in the healthcare industry. And I think that one of the biggest drivers of that is patients, right? Patients are beginning to demand the same level of innovation and service from health service providers that they see in other service sectors, like, online shopping, travel, media. And, patients in the broadening community are also increasingly demanding better service and care, but they need to be able to trust that the innovations in healthcare are well vetted and executed responsibly. And that's where the clinicians come in. The clinicians really have to be a steward for their patients, because they have to make sure that they're communicating with industry to make sure that these innovations that are being brought about are actually going to solve real problems for patients. Patients' lives are at stake. Patient safety is at stake. And so it's really not an option to do, the move fast and break things that we typically speak of in innovation and disruption. But the good thing is that generally clinicians are eager to engage. They're frustrated and they want to do something about it. We've come across, I'm sure, plenty of laggards in our careers when it comes to adopting healthcare innovation. But
Shelli, sorry to interrupt. Your audio is a little bit choppy. Okay. It might be your internet connection, or I don't know.
Sorry, I don't know.
Seems better when you're closer to the laptop, maybe. For me, sometimes putting on.
Okay, yeah, that's the issue. Yeah. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. I will. Okay, can you see my screen again?
Yes.
Okay, is this better?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. I'll try to speak more loudly. So again, just, clinicians are eager to engage. They want to help solve problems, and we know that innovation in healthcare can't happen without those clinician insights. And I think innovators that do take the time to source expertise early and often have a better understanding of, clinical workflows and their challenges and preferences of the audience that they ultimately intend to serve. And I think that they're ultimately more successful as well. And so, we'll focus a lot today on just how do we move forward? How do we bridge that knowledge gap? And really, what are the rules for engaging clinicians in this space? So looking at the outline for the rules for engaging clinicians, this is really what we'll spend time kind of drilling down into each of these steps in today's Lunch and Learn. And, I know that Laura has some really interesting insight and stories, that she's heard from the field, and I do as well, about, just different ways to go about this. And of course, the unfortunate pitfalls for times when this isn't done, or, when innovators don't engage clinicians, or when they do it a little bit differently. And so I think, again, sourcing diverse perspectives is really important. Engaging early and often, focusing on really capturing multiple viewpoints, so the volume of people that you talk to ultimately, setting and managing expectations, and then also just building lasting relationships. You know, if you're looking to service healthcare, the relationship aspect is really important. You know, you want to make sure that they see you as somebody who is providing value and not just going to them and trying to, you know, pick their brain and you know, get something from your audience, but really that you're giving something in return. And so I think that's really important on the lasting relationships piece. So the first piece on sourcing diverse perspectives, unfortunately, we know that innovation doesn't do a great job of serving all patients, and that there are plenty of populations that are left out of healthcare innovation as it is today. And it's really important to focus on changing that. And that starts with engaging the perspectives of clinicians from diverse backgrounds. You know, we know that diverse representation helps drive development of viable solutions. We know that diversity is great for innovation. We know that it drives growth, it stimulates novel thinking, and ultimately improves outcomes. And, you know, sourcing expertise from people of different races, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status, age, abilities, and beliefs really inspires solutions that are truly innovative. And so I think that, you know, a lot of times our first thought is to go into our network and start sourcing people to talk to. And if you have a really great diverse network, that's wonderful, but a lot of people have networks that are very similar to them, right? And they tend to find people that are practicing medicine, you know, in their same town or city, in a similar type of institution. And it's not just about, you know, diversity from ethnicity and race and background, it's also the experience that they've had, right? And the type of practice that they lead. And so I think it's really important to focus on the perspectives that you're getting from a diversity perspective. And if you don't have the right people in your network, you have to go outside of your network and try to find people who are going to be able to give you, you know, diverse perspectives. And I've heard so many times in the field when, you know, this has been an unfortunate scenario where the, you know, innovator has not sourced diverse perspectives, and they go down a path that ultimately doesn't lead anywhere good. And, you know, I think that we talk a lot about this from the innovator perspective, but this happens with large companies as well. You know, I was speaking with someone who had an experience that they were working with a really large pharmaceutical company, and they were actually sourcing information about a population for a drug that they were developing, and the compound in the drug tasted really bad. And so they spent a lot of time going down a road to find this like kind of candy coating that would disguise the taste of this pill and this medication. And ultimately they spent a lot of time and effort bringing that to market, only to find that the patients that suffered from this particular issue, about 80% of them were on a feeding tube. And so the taste of the medication really had nothing to do with it. And, you know, again, they were just sourcing basically opinions and perspectives from people in their insular network. And they ended up coming to the point where they weren't solving a problem for the patients that they needed to treat, and that they spent a lot of time, effort, and money going down a path that could have been avoided had they really focused on, you know, getting diverse perspectives and looking for those specific patients that were impacted.
Yeah, Shelli, I have, you know, to jump in and just tell another story is, so yours was from a patient perspective. And one tip is, if you need patient perspective now, there are so many patient advocacy groups. And you can actually go to those nonprofits and you can talk to them. And usually the director, the CEO will actually come up with a group of patients for you. They need to know that you're serious. They need to know that this is not a small engagement, but they're there. They're actually wanting to work with you. So that's one just sort of tip of how to get to those patients, because you don't always need to go through clinicians, because clinicians may not even have patients for you. Plus there's HIPAA regulations. So going to patient advocacy group and nonprofits is one way to do it. But back to the story, going down the wrong path, we use that story over and over again. So I got tired of it, but since you guys didn't hear it, I'll tell you. There was a device that was developed with a lot of feedback from physicians. And when it was brought to market, it turned out that because it was the nurse that had to use it, they happened to carry clips, paper clips in the left hand, and the device was developed for the left hand. It was supposed to be the right hand. So little things like that, where the prototype was developed, fully developed, not the entire product, but the prototype, and they had to go all the way back and scrap all the molds that they created.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if we sat here for a while, Laura, you and I could come up with a million examples on on this. But again, and that's the diverse perspective aspect, right? I mean, sourcing opinions from nurses, that's making sure that you're getting the full picture and the full perspective. And that's really important.
And nurses, a lot of times, I don't know in your experience, but in my experience, nurses are sometimes easier to talk to. And also one angle with hospitals is because a lot of hospitals have magnet designations, and part of it is nurses need to be involved in innovation and research. Before, it used to be a lot heavier on research, less so on innovation, but now that's changing too. So they have to show that their nurses are engaged in innovation. So that's a great way to align yourself. Can you find a nurse who is passionate about the same subject, and can you pair up with them and do some research that benefits the hospital, that benefits that nurse, that nurses group, and again, ultimately, because they care about magnet status, that aligns you with the hospital.
Absolutely. And, it's interesting because, and I think that's the case with a lot of these, steps on our checklist here, is that they kind of bleed into one another, because the same thing with sourcing diverse perspectives, right? Clearly the nurses in your example, Laura, were not engaged early enough either, right? They built the prototype before engaging the nurses. And I think that is something that, again, you're going down the wrong road. And I should have added in this, this slide, it says involve physicians, right? It should say clinicians over physicians in general, but engaging early and often is really important, because healthcare solutions that are designed and developed with that clinician input early and often can really avoid those missteps that are driven by a lack of understanding of how the clinical environment works, or something as simple of what hand they're going to use, or what hand they would prefer to hold a device in. And, I think that clinicians also know their patients, and they can help companies understand how their products may impact patient care and engagement. So, I think it's important to certainly, as Laura had mentioned, get to those patient advocacy groups and engage the patients, but also, if you're speaking with clinicians, if you're speaking with physicians and nurses, talk to them about the way that they treat their patients and the experience that their patients have. And really, I think that there's this interesting concept around kind of co-design, and really beginning in the early stages, talking to as many people as you possibly can, and co-designing the solution with them. They are in this environment every day, and they know the problems that they face, and they know those little intricacies about their workflow, or just the flow of the hospital, the way things are set up, and they understand the maybe small things, they may seem like a small thing to an innovator, can really make a big impact when you're practicing medicine. And so the earlier you engage with those people, I think that you're setting yourself up for success.
Yeah. Also, it's just the culture of healthcare, and physicians especially. They're not very forgiving once you bring them something that doesn't work, either with their workflow or something else, that they realize that they start judging. That's just the culture, and it kills you sometimes, because they're not being kind to a startup that shows up with a device that there's this one little thing that's wrong, and they focus on it, so like laser focus on it, and that just comes from the culture. So when you engage early, you haven't made those mistakes, and they can be, so much more forgiving. And I watched it over and over again. It's really just the psychology of it too.
Yeah, speaking of the psychology of it as well, right? Like they feel more buy-in when you engage them early, instead of coming and saying, I built this, what do you think? And you're right, Laura, if they feel like something's not right or off, they're going to feel like you didn't do your research, and they feel slighted by that because, they think like, if you're going to come to me now and ask for my opinion, why not have come to me in the beginning? And I could have helped you avoid, going down the wrong path and whatnot. So I think, it also speaks to kind of building those relationships early.
Yeah, just understanding the culture of judgment is
Yeah.
pretty prevalent. So you
Yeah.
will be judged for all mistakes that you made, and then you kind of ruin your reputation, unfortunately.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, again, there's that diverse viewpoints, and then there are multiple viewpoints. And I think that we have to think about it from multiple perspectives, right? There's a common saying in healthcare, if you've seen one hospital, you've seen one hospital. And I think that it also can be applied to if you've spoken to one clinician, you've spoken to one clinician. You have to have a pretty large sample size in healthcare because people are so specialized in healthcare, and also healthcare is extremely variable. And so I think that the more perspectives that you get, the better you can answer those key questions about potential applications of a solution, thinking about how broadly it could be employed. Again, back to the workflow, how it may fit into a workflow, and what patient populations might be best served. Because ultimately, again, you can talk to, physicians that are, practicing, you can speak to nurses, you might also want to talk to the chief medical officer or administration, right? But it's important to really garner feedback from multiple levels and in multiple different types of practice settings, academic medical centers as well as community medical centers, and also, those that are practicing in, say, smaller hospitals like critical access. I had come across a company that was working with a physician from Mass General Hospital here in Boston, which is one of the largest academic medical centers in the country. And they were working to design a solution with this physician at Mass General. And I was just asking them questions about their model and what they were focused on. And the solution that they were developing was to be sold into critical access hospitals. And the thing that they didn't understand is that critical access hospital and Mass General have absolutely nothing in common. Mass General has very little in common with other large academic medical centers. If you were to go to Cleveland Clinic or the Mayo Clinic on a Tuesday and then go to Mass General on a Wednesday, you would feel like you're on a different planet because the way they do things are so different. And if you're looking to roll out something that's going to be, sold into multiple environments, you need to consistently understand those environments. And, again, Laura mentioned the culture. The culture is different at different organizations. The way they do things is different. And so you really have to take on that, that focus of garnering multiple perspectives. And I know, Laura, you had something from this perspective from a children's hospital, right?
On that one, I actually wanted to bring up maybe a different story, but it has to do with different setting. You reminded me when you were talking about the Mass Gen. So there was a startup doing something around video recording that involved patients. And the idea actually came from a clinician, from a physician, but it was an orthopedic setting. They did surgeries. Everyone was fine doing recordings. The product went to market, and then they could not sell it easily to the hospitals because the legal in a small private practice or big private practice is different. When it's physician group that's involved, they make decisions differently. They have a much more latitude to make those decisions. The moment you're in the hospital and the legal is involved, you're looking at all different arguments why something that worked in other setting and you thought that the traction should be there just does not translate. Again, usually you do not have a legal department in a private physician practice. You definitely have a legal department in the hospital. And it's just something to be aware. And when Shelli, when you said talk to the chief medical officer, I think it's so important because you will get some things exposed that physicians are not aware of. Things like legal aspects, right? Only the chief medical officer will probably bring it up because he has been or she has been sitting in enough meetings where they heard from the legal, they were pushed, they couldn't push back, and they knew there was a dead end. Again, if you can make a friend with the legal department, more power to you because you will learn a lot.
Absolutely. And I think that's really important to think of as well, as you are capturing those multiple viewpoints. Like a chief medical officer is going to look at things very differently from, the staff physician or a resident. And it's the same with, sometimes you're selling into, hospital CEOs ultimately, or the COO, but the views of physicians and the chief medical officer are still going to come in play, but every stakeholder has a little bit of a different perspective. And it's really important to understand not only their perspective, but what makes this a good fit for them, right? What's the win for each individual person? And I think the more that you can kind of network and speak to those people and understand their perspective, the better opportunity you have to build something that is going to be, used and adopted in practice.
Yeah, I have stories where even having a champion in a physician champion who's actually high enough on the sort of hospital ladder, but does not have that final administrative hat. And projects went forward full blast. Money was spent, and there was reassurance that yes, this is definitely needed. Only to have it killed by the COO.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that's the thing, sometimes a chief medical officer, depending on the organization, they don't have a budget at their disposal to ultimately sign a contract or make a decision about something. And so I think that a lot of times people feel like, oh, I've got, the head of neurosurgery on my side. He loves using this tool. But if the culture of the organization doesn't let individual physicians make those types of decisions, then it doesn't matter how much that person, likes that device or product. It's not going to get signed off on by the administration. And I think that's really important to understand in individual organizations, is who has a budget, who has signing authority, because ultimately, your clinical buyer is not always your economic buyer. So,
and the fact that you may be told by a physician that it's a sure thing, he's absolutely clear that it will, they will buy it, they will want it. You want to, just as a tip, you want to set up a meeting with someone from the administration. Ask your physician to set up that meeting, because you want to hear firsthand. Because if an administrator is assuming that it's the physician group that'll be paying for it, of course they're happy. They don't care.
Yeah.
But if a physician is assuming that the hospital will be paying, and you don't have that critical meeting, so that's one thing I say: set up that meeting so that everyone is hearing what everyone is saying.
Yeah, absolutely. I think again, just get it over with. Try to get to as many people as you can. I know it's not always fun having the conversations with clinician about who is going to pay for this, right? Because people aren't always that comfortable talking about the money early on, but I think that the earlier you can have that conversation and understand, where the money's coming from, whose budget, who is going to sign the contract, is really important. And again, the more multiple viewpoints that you're capturing, the better you'll understand the landscape of the organization you've engaged those people early on in the process, the economic buyer, then it won't come as a shock to them when it's time to make a decision about something, and they'll feel like their input has been valued throughout the entire process. And, you know, from my perspective, those type of deals, they go through much easier than when somebody feels like they're being brought in at the end. So this one is really important, and it's, you know, really about respect with, you know, clinicians. They're very busy, and I think that if they take the time to talk to you, or if you set up something with them, you know, if you schedule time, stick to it, right? And if you have the funding to compensate physicians for their time and expertise, you should do it. You know, everybody, I think, has this perspective of clinicians and, you know, the money that they make. And, you know, these days, I think there's a lot of clinician burnout, right? They are working really, really hard. There's unfortunately a lot of stress that's been added from the EMR. And I think that they want to, you know, speak to what they're passionate about. They want to engage with entrepreneurs. But they're usually, when they're doing so, they're taking time that is, you know, would be reserved for their family, right? Or for them to relax. And so I think that, you know, if you have the funding to compensate them for their time and input, do it. If you don't, you know, try to be as respectful as possible. You know, if you're seeking volunteered or if it's compensated input, you know, you should really consider making sure that you show appreciation for their engagement by, you know, sharing the progress that you've made, showing them how you've incorporated some of their feedback into the model. You know, what has the impact of their time and expertise had on your product? Or, you know, maybe you've implemented a new solution, or, you know, some way that they have helped you along the way. And I think that's, you know, really important, and that goes a long way in building that relationship and building up the mutual respect. Because, you know, whether they're compensated or not, they're, you know, they're giving you their time and their effort, and you want to make sure that you show them that you value that.
And I want to just kind of bring up the other side of it. I've seen mistakes made when a startup, desperate for clinician input, gets that clinician, and they actually go a little too far. All of a sudden, that clinician is now a partner. And no one discussed what a partner means. And all of a sudden, speaking of expectations, the clinician is expecting that that's a 50-50 split. Or sometimes a clinician would have an idea, and they talk about with others, let's say engineers, start developing it. And they expect that clinician would help much more beyond that point, where the clinician is, my expectation was, I give you my idea, I'm done, I'm entitled to, you know, compensation. Again, sometimes 50-50, that's what they expect, or even more. Sometimes they think that the idea is worth more than the development that the engineers have done. It's not that, it's nothing but just wrong expectations. But it will come to bite you in a big way if you don't manage them. Mm-hmm. It goes both ways. You know, again, you have to be respectful of physicians and not take advantage of them. At the same time, you will be taken advantage of, not because they want to take advantage of you, just because they honestly believe that what they provide is valuable to that extent.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, again, this just all comes to the communication piece of it as well. You know, I think that if you can formalize something, you should do it. It's always great to just outline your expectations on paper. And, you know, even if it's just in an email, that really bullet points, you know, the expectations, and, you know, if there's compensation, if there's not compensation, that's really important, just so that everyone is on the same page. Because, you know, Laura's right, people can go down a road and, you know, think that they have agreed on something, right? But again, unless it's in writing, it's very rare to see, you know, both sides really being on the same page. And I think it's important to get people on the same page from the very beginning. Those conversations are not always the fun conversations, but it's worthwhile to have them. And, it's really important and it would save you a lot of, headache down the road for sure.
Also, IP comes into play with that, right? Because you need to understand who owns the IP.
Yeah.
If you get too far into conversations, again, there's some expectations around the IP. Sometimes, going back to the example, if a physician has an idea for a device, they think they own the IP for the entire device that will later on be developed by engineers, where the engineers are expecting to get most of the IP, if not almost all of it, and just share something back, because they actually figured out how to build the device, not just that device doing XYZ should be built. Those are very different things. Again, hospitals may have policies around IPs. So a physician may never own an IP. You need to know, because otherwise the hospital will claim it or an academic center will claim it. So again, you have to be clear, you have to ask. So the rules of engagement is you ask questions about IP.
Yeah, absolutely. Some organizations are also very, limiting on their clinicians for their ability to consult or work with entrepreneurs. And other organizations are very open to it and they encourage it. But it's important to understand that dynamic, because, if a clinician is working with you and you're developing something in tandem and their organization does not support that, or they have a clause in their contract, just like Laura had mentioned, that whatever they create while they're working at that institution is owned by the institution, that's really problematic. And so those are really important things to understand from the very beginning. And then lastly, it all goes back to building those lasting relationships. When we say engaging clinicians, I think that especially in the early days, it's really, really ideal to avoid pitching yourself or your company. It's a conversation, and clinicians want to help. They get into medicine because they want to help and treat patients. And so starting a conversation about the problem that you're trying to solve is really the best way to go about it, right? And really listen and pay attention when they're talking, ask questions, engage them on the topics that they're passionate about. I think that's the best way to really get the input that you're looking for. Instead of telling them, this is what's really great about my company and what I'm doing, ask them questions about, how you could do this to make it great. How can you really truly develop a solution that is going to solve complex problems, and give something in value in return, a solution, a fresh perspective. Early on and throughout the relationship, I always find it to be valuable, if you're searching blogs or social media or things that are going to help you, and you find things that might be of interest to some of the clinicians that you've engaged, send it to them as well. Set them up with people that would want to work with them, or people that they would be interested in talking to. I think that as you're building that relationship, these good deeds, they tend to pay off. And I think that if you approach it from the perspective of, hey, I'm an entrepreneur and I'm trying to solve this problem, and I'm not 100% sure the best way to go about it, but I have some ideas about what I think I want to do, and engaging the clinician. We had a company that worked with my company that was in the very, very early stages of developing something, and they kind of outlined initially the way that they were going to do it, and they engaged clinicians saying, this is what we're doing. And the feedback that they got in that scenario wasn't great, right? Because a lot of clinicians said, oh, that doesn't work, or nope, I've seen it done that way, it's not going to work, or I don't believe in that, right? Versus like, here's the problem that we're trying to solve. And then they were able to open up a much broader, more, I would say, the collaborative dialogue with the clinicians by doing that. And they, when they approached it from that perspective, right, they were able to kind of come up with a solution that was very similar to the way that they initially intended to do things, but there were just specific aspects of it that had changed to make it more palatable to the clinicians. And so to me, that was really just more of a focus on co-design. And they built some really great relationships throughout that process as well, because the clinicians felt like, oh, I'm being collaborative here. I'm not just telling somebody like, yes or no, this idea is good or bad. It's, they're asking me open-ended questions about how they can make it a great solution, and what would it have to look at for me to use it, or, for this to be something that ultimately is helping my patients. And so I think that, across all of these steps, if you look at this as, not an opportunity for sales or an opportunity to, do market research, but really building those relationships and making it a collaborative engagement is really where you're going to get, I think, the most value out of any of this. And, the other thing is just, if you build those relationships in the beginning, some of those people very well may be your first customers, right? Because they've kind of helped you co-design something, and they tend to feel like, on board with that solution. And if you've built that relationship and you've nurtured that relationship, then those are people that are going to go, maybe to the economic buyer in their institution and say, look, I've worked with this person and I like this solution. I think it's something that we should try out. And so I think that if you invest in the relationships, there's a payoff for that for sure. And even if you don't end up, ultimately getting to an end product or getting the sale, those relationships will stick with you throughout, your other endeavors. I have, clinicians that I built relationships with very early on in my career that are extremely helpful to me today. And maybe if there's something that they can't help me with, they will introduce me to somebody that can. There's kind of that 6 degrees of separation in medicine, just like there is in the regular world. And so I think that building the relationships and coming at it with that type of focus is really, it's just kind of a nice overarching principle to think about in regard to engaging clinicians.
And I just want to sort of give a tip for anyone, and I will get back to Jeremy about IP. One thing you can do is you can ask your clinician champions to engage other clinicians from other institutions. Because if there's one thing that can come and bite you, it's that you will develop it for that institution, and you will not be able, and again, when Shelli says engage them early, if you play out that scenario, you engage your clinician early, right? You build it, but then you only engage other clinicians at a later stage. Remember, it's going to be the same thing. You engage them too late. So one thing I love to do is, can we have a collaboration with another institution? Because they all go to medical schools, they all go to different healthcare systems. They have their friends at other hospitals. You have to get someone from another hospital involved early. And again, just kind of keep in mind that every new person that comes late in the game, because they're physicians, they will have their judgments, they will have their sort of, okay, now I'm just being used for feedback. So those relationships need to be cross-institutional. So as far as IP questions, so Jeremy asked, how do you figure out those types of IP conflicts with clinicians? They may not understand the nuances and will likely not share the employment agreement from their hospital. There is no sort of way to really check it on, based on their employment contract, because some physicians can actually have different arrangements, but they should be able to tell you, because hospitals have policies, and those policies are not secret, and they don't have to show you their own contract to let you know what the arrangements are. They may not know, you're right, but you have to press them to find out from the administration, because that's easy for them. It's just an email to their legal saying, hey, what is our IP policy? And internal legal always answers the email from the physician. They will not answer your email. So it has to come from them. Shelli, do you have any input on that? How did you deal with it?
Yeah, I mean, so on our tool, we have clinicians that are open to do consulting, and that is, part of our terms and conditions, really focusing on the fact that, you as the clinician understand the terms of your employment, and you are certifying that you're not violating those terms by consulting through Enlightened. And I think that, yeah, they're not all super familiar. And, some of them basically, before they enter into a relationship with Enlightened, will just go to their organization and ask, is this something I'm allowed to do? And, I will say, for the most part, I would say 90% of hospitals are perfectly okay with their clinicians doing consulting and doing things outside, because ultimately it elevates that clinician's brand as well, and brings more patients to them. But there are those organizations out there that don't agree, and so, yeah, I think it's just as simple as having the clinician ask. And we've had organizations come back and say no, and there's really nothing you can do at that point, but at least
Yeah, sometimes it's the share of the IP. Sometimes it's a percentage, and different hospitals that have absolutely different approaches to that. But again, just ask your physician to email their own legal department, because sometimes clinicians don't like to say I don't know. So you have to make it easy for them by saying, hey, would you mind? Let's find out. Can you email your legal? If you tell them, if you show them a path and it's easy, they will follow. But if you leave it open-ended, like, can you tell me, can you find out, and you don't tell them, send an email to your legal department, I swear to God, sometimes clinicians just don't, they don't know where to go. They don't actually know which department to even ask, and it gets sort of pushed off to the side, and they don't give you an answer. Not because they don't want to, but because they've never dealt with it. Usually, when they sign up to teach at the hospital or to practice, they don't read their contracts. And IP is, they read what's important, which is money, and what they have to do. But things like IP, they always gloss over, because unless they've done it before, they've been involved with startups, that's just not on their mind. So just to wrap it up, I think, I just want to stress that, there are many ways to reach physicians. You have to do it through your own network. There are no, unless you're using a platform that connects physicians and startups like Shelli's platform, for example, and some others in the space that do similar, matching. You really have to do it through your own network. But it's, there's no magic bullet. You have to find an uncle, you have to find a cousin, whoever you can find, in a warm introduction, and kind of go that route. Beyond that, I would recommend going to the conferences that they attend. And yes, you may be bored out of your mind listening, but stick in there and soak it up. So you speak their language, even if it's the pain that they feel. Own it. As an editor for Physicians News Network, I used to go to insurance conferences. I used to go to independent physician groups conferences, conferences of lifestyle medicine. I can't tell you how much I learned about how they think, and these groups are so different. Another interesting angle maybe right now is, and I don't know, I don't have a personal experience with it, but I'm still going to throw it out there. It's the Clubhouse app. And I'm only saying it because I glance, I haven't really used it, but I'm on it, and I glance and I see my physician friends talking about something, and I know they're talking about medicine as well. So that might be an interesting new way to engage with them, especially those who are actually active. Those who are running societies, any type of innovation in healthcare, try to reach out to those, because they're the easy hanging fruit. They love to engage, they want to engage. There are obviously physician-run funds like Angel MD, who invest. So again, those physicians, if you find them on LinkedIn, because they're interested in investing, they are interested in entrepreneurship. Again, that's your low-hanging fruit. That's a physician who already has a taste of it. Also, when you looking at different centers, look at the innovation centers inside of hospitals. They may not be called innovation centers or institutes. They may be called just innovation groups, innovation council. Try to reach out to those, because they are actively trying. That's their goal and mission, to do something innovative. Just like I mentioned, nurses who need to do some research to maintain the status. Again, you're trying to figure out what their motivations are, what they need. How do they report back at the end of the year that they did a great job innovating? if that's what they're supposed to do. Any innovation committee has to do something. So try to find those people. Once you know who they are, you can try to, you can try approaching them on LinkedIn. But again, if you can find a warm introduction, warm connection, go that route.